All right, welcome back to our last lesson for now in this course. I have totally changed backgrounds. I've been moving around a lot in the last few months, so I am in a new place, and this is embracing change and embracing impermanence, that everything changes, even the backgrounds of our screens. Um, I hope that your course has been wonderful so far, and for this last class, this last lesson section is going to be exploring the, not like necessarily the pitfalls, but kind of the misunderstandings and misconceptions that seem to come up and arise on this path of um, like eventually becoming a better human and then letting that human go in this transition between the little me and the big me, and holding both and what that really means. And so today we're going to speak about some things that come up a lot that people seem to be confused about or misunderstand, so that we can kind of clear out these misconceptions, so we can have a more clear path of really what's happening and why we're doing it. So let's do it. We're going to take 2 deep inhales and exhales to kind of like center in and be present. So let's do that together. Take a deep inhale. Beautiful. So the first thing we're going to speak about is there's a lot of good stuff in here. We're going to go over some paradoxes, things that don't make sense anymore the deeper you get on this kind of spiritual path. We're going to talk about misunderstanding concepts. For example, attachment and the idea of attachment. We're going to kind of explore that. And we'll see where we go from there. So the idea is, the reason that there's many things that are often confused is one aspect is that there are many layers to our lives. We've kind of spoken about this before in previous lessons, that we can look at the world of the form world, the material world, and we have this kind of like energetic world. And in the world of form, we have matter, material, linear timelines, very predictable. If I drop the glass, I know it falls. And there's rules in that world. And then we have another world that we're living in at the same time, where our emotions, our thoughts, our breath, our words, these are all kind of this formless world. And they have kind of different rules and different thoughts and different ways to interact with them. So a lot of the misconceptions we have, and a lot of the paradoxes, the reason that we start to get into these misunderstandings and paradoxes, is because we're often talking about 2 different worlds at the same time. And what is true for one world isn't necessarily true for the other world, but we're actually experiencing them both. And essentially, the spiritual path to some degree is like the letting go of identification with our little material body, and the re-identification or the remembering of our true nature, which is a much larger force that isn't physical. And so in this process of letting go of the material and then receiving this immaterial, while still recognizing that we are partially the material, we're really in between these 2 worlds, and we start to see that there's a lot of things that apply to one world but not the other, but they're actually happening at the same time, even though they're very different. It's very funny. And a lot of the reason that misconception happens, or these misconceptions happen, is because of our language. When I say the word I, or the way our society has taught us to refer to ourselves is by pointing to our body. I even point me. But really, this isn't me. This is just a part of me. And what I am, or what me is much larger. It's like the true self, or the higher self, or God, or whatever. So basically, because we have this world of like ego and this world of much bigger than me, we have these 2 frameworks that we're working with that often oppose each other and exist at the same time. So that's kind of why a lot of what we're going to talk about is happening. And it's hard to grasp because we're looking at different layers, or we're speaking to a certain layer without actually saying that. And so sometimes we take that for the wrong layer. Letting go of myself. It's like, whoa, what does that even really mean? And it's like, oh, the big I is letting go of the little I. So we're talking about 2 different layers. So, okay, cool. So let's first talk about attachment and non-attachment. So there's this beautiful concept in Buddhism, in Taoism, in many Eastern cultures that talk about non-attachment. And a huge misconception with non-attachment is people say like, well, I don't want to not have desires. Desire is a good thing. It's good to have motivation. It's good to have a drive and a push for things. And that's absolutely true that non-attachment is not the absence of desire. And that's a huge thing. It's not that I'm just like completely aloof and detached. And that's it. Non-attachment isn't the same as detachment. Detachment, and there's another word for it that's really wonderful that I can't remember right now, but it's essentially being aloof or not caring, is almost a defense mechanism that our mind has in order to bring separation between something that we actually do really care about. And so it's almost like our mind is pretending like we don't care about. But non-attachment is really this idea, and here's the paradox. It's like moving towards something without really needing to get there. So it's like loving someone so deeply without really needing them. And desiring for them to be there, but if they're not there, then that's totally okay. And that's this idea of non-attachment. It's this moving towards without needing to achieve. It's like the goalless goal or the pathless path. It's like, yeah, I'm going to walk in that direction and see what happens along the way, because it's not really about getting that thing. It's about the journey. So non-attachment focuses on the journey rather than the outcome. So people who have non-attachment might live a life very similar in a very similar way to someone who is attached, but the only difference that you can really see is how they're receiving the outcomes, how they're receiving life. So yes, someone with attachment and someone with non-attachment would both train their dog, but the one without attachment doesn't get so frustrated when it barks or when it misbehaves, because it understands that it's really not about that. It's about the exploration and experience and curiosity. Now, non-attachment is something that isn't something that you develop necessarily. It's not like you can practice non-attachment. It's kind of a funny idea. It's like a byproduct that arises out of meditation and out of observation. When you start to really observe and expand your awareness through meditation, you start to see the world in a deeper way. So you start to see larger than your little egoic world. You start to see how things are interconnected. And through that witnessing of interconnection, you start to see how intelligent the universe is. And when you see how intelligent the universe is, you see that it's actually amazing how intricate and perfectly planned everything is. And when you start to see that with your own eyes, it's not me telling you, it's you witnessing the experience, then there's almost no choice but for non-attachment to arise, because you see that one truth is that everything is changing. And you can know that in your head, but when it drops into your heart and you're witnessing the change, you're witnessing it on a fundamental level, and you're seeing that everything is providing for something else, and there's this beautiful master, I don't want to say master plan, but this beautiful symphony that's playing, then you start to just kind of, it's not like, oh, I'm trying to not get attached, because that's attachment to non-attachment, right? I really want to not be attached to this is an oxymoron. You can't really want to not want, it's kind of funny. But what happens is, without even really trying, just the practice of meditation and different spiritual practices where we start to expand our awareness, a natural product of that is non-attachment, because you just kind of start to, it's not that important anymore to get what you want. And, Ram Dass has this wonderful saying that's so profound. He said, you don't have to get rid of your neurotices. You just kind of stop identifying with them. It's not that Jesus didn't get annoyed when this happened or didn't have desire, but a huge misconception is, in order to arrive at non-attachment, you have to rid yourself of desire. And that's, at least in my experience, not the truth. It's not a linear process. It's not like, okay, if I stop desiring, I won't be attached. Rather, it's this idea that I'm really kind of in right now and exploring, that I still see that my desires are there. They'll never leave, at least at this point. Like, I still desire things, I still crave things, I still want things. And I can't seem to get rid of the desires. But one thing that's very interesting starts to happen. It's almost as if the more your identification shifts to a bigger, more energetic you, then the little you is still there, but it just takes up way less space. So let's say my desires are the same as they were 10 years ago, but the package that holds the desires is fading away and is much smaller. So it's almost like, oh, wow, I see that the little me is desiring something. And if you think about that sentence, it's like I'm witnessing that the little me really wants something. Whereas 10 years ago, it was I really want something. And see the huge difference there. When you're witnessing something happen, it doesn't pull you. And that's what's so interesting, is that it's almost like you're turning the volume down on what holds the desires. And the desires are the same, take up the same amount of the little me, but the little me is much smaller. And that's this idea. You don't have to rid yourself of desire. You don't have to rid yourself of craving, even though there is benefit in really working with that. And it's wonderful as well. But what starts to happen is when you shift anyway, it's almost like trying to make your body look nice when it's going to die anyway. And there's value in that. Yes, like make your body look beautiful while it's alive, but don't worry about it so much because it's going to go away also. And that's one of these other paradoxes. It's like two processes are happening at the same time, and then there's value in both of them. So it's almost like there's value in accepting my death and knowing that I'm going to die and this body is going to die. But I still put a helmet on when I get on the motorbike. And someone might say, well, why do you put a helmet on if you're okay with death? And it's not necessarily that being okay with death means I'm going to be reckless. It's rather, I'm going to accept what's inevitably going to happen, and I'm going to live my life fully at the same time. I'm going to try to make my body look beautiful because I love it and I want to celebrate it, while also knowing that it will pass. And that's this root idea of non-attachment. Non-attachment, almost like another word for non-attachment that is it's much more vibrant, is celebration. The concept of non-attachment is a continual celebration of what is happening. Like, oh yes, now I'm in my own space and I get to sleep alone tonight. And then tomorrow I'm like, oh yes, my partner is sleeping over and I love her so much. And the idea is witnessing what is happening. It's like, and that's the expanded awareness. Once we witness what's happening, we can celebrate it. And it's this constant celebration of what is arising rather than what isn't happening that I want to happen. So that's the concept of non-attachment. And it is a paradox. It's accepting what is while at the same time not tolerating what is. So here's our second misconception. There's this idea of acceptance, and a lot of people believe that acceptance is a passive action. It's like, oh, I guess I'm just going to accept what's happening, which means tolerate. But acceptance isn't the same thing as tolerance. So acceptance is not an action, rather an orientation point where we're acting from. And we speak about this in a past lesson, but it's this idea that I'm accepting what is so that I can work with what wants to be. But before I can change anything from a place of heartfulness and spaciousness is to accept that it's happening. I have to recognize that I'm angry before I can move through the anger. I have to recognize where I am before I can move from that space. So the second misconception is this idea that acceptance means rolling over and tolerating what's happening. But just because something's happening doesn't mean that that needs to happen forever. Rather, we witness it happening, we accept it, we celebrate it, and then we let go of it. And that's this constant process. Acceptance, celebration, letting go. Acceptance, celebration, letting go. So those are a few of the paradoxes that we really start to see, and a lot of us believe that. Okay, so we'll get into two more. We talked about meditation a little bit as well earlier, but I'll go over this one again. That a lot of people believe that meditation is the absence of thought, and at least in my experience, that's not the truth. Meditation is the deep knowing that everything we are looking for is already here, is already present with us. And then we don't need to seek anymore. We don't need to seek silence because the silence that we're seeking is already here. And a lot of people believe that silence can only happen when we have a quiet mind. But the truth is that there's always silence behind the noise. And we speak about this again in one of the other lessons where we talk about this beautiful concert hall. There's this amazing symphony hall that's silent and spacious, and then the band comes in to play in the evening, and as they're playing with lots of noise and there's people there, there's still the spaciousness that holds the sound. So it's really looking at the spaciousness beyond the sound, behind the sound as the background, to recognize that it doesn't matter if there's sound or commotion arising, the peacefulness is already there. It's always there, in the mind, in our own structure. We don't have to go somewhere to find silence. That's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful thing to go find a silent space. It really supports and adds to our meditation and enriches the meditation. However, that's not always possible. And so what would it look like if we no longer were dependent on our mind being quiet, on anything outside of us giving us the perfect situation so that we can finally find peace, rather seeing that it's already here? So meditation is not the absence of thought. It's the recognition that we don't need to identify with our thoughts, and we can see beyond that to see the silence that is always there. And then start realizing that maybe that silence is me too. And maybe that's actually even more me or different me. And that's the process that happens. It's not a goal, it's just the direction that we walk in. The second piece of this is that there's this idea about enlightenment, that if I get enlightened, then everything will be blissful and feel great. And that's also not the truth. Okay, so there's that, and at the same time there's this idea that a lot of people don't want to practice meditation because they're afraid that they will become completely complacent and not feel emotion anymore, that everything will just be like okay. And neither of those are true. The nature of the universe and our own bodily structure is that everything is always changing, which means emotions just arise. The more we meditate, it's not that emotions stop arising. Rather, it's the amount of time and power that the emotion has over us is much smaller. So an emotion arises and we receive it differently than in the past. Emotions will always come. That's the first arrow in Zen Buddhism, is that the universe will shoot you with an arrow. Oh, you get a text message that someone you love passed away. That will always bring up sorrow. And it'll be different for different people, but that will never end. There will always be emotion. But what happens when we meditate is that our relationship to the emotions change. We stop identifying with the emotions. We stop saying, I'm sad. And we start to say, I'm experiencing sadness. It's very different. So meditation doesn't create a bliss state or a state. Rather, it allows for the dynamicism to move without getting caught up in the drama. It's like getting to go look at the ocean when there's a storm and when there's sunny days and when there's rain and when there's clouds, and just getting to watch it is so beautiful. And it's very different when you're watching it from the side, from the shore, than when you're on top of the ocean. It's very unpleasant to be in the ocean when it's raining and when it's storming and then when it's sunny and then. So that's the idea, is that we move with the flow of life rather than trying to avoid or go towards one state. So if we're practicing meditation with the goal of this bliss state, then that's the ego. The ego wants that. when we start to really deepen into meditation without the ego, we see that it doesn't really matter what's happening. We're okay with that. So I'm both, and here's a wonderful paradox. I'm both angry and okay with being I'm both experiencing anger and okay with experiencing the anger at the same time. It's two different layers. It's like the real me and what that me is experiencing. I'm experiencing anger, and that's okay. And so our language is very limiting in that often we say like either you're angry or you're happy, or you're angry or you're okay, because you can only be one thing at a time. But when we start to disidentify and like and detach and step into non-attachment, we start to celebrate whatever's happening. And anger might be what's happening, and we celebrate that. So it's really shifting the perspective, and because when we change the perspective, it allows for a more multidimensional experience, because we are a multidimensional being. We're living in multiple dimensions. We're living in the dimension of space and time, of matter and form, and we're living in this other dimension that is like super abstract, and like what are thoughts and what are dreams and where do they go and where do you find them? Is there a catalog with all the dreams and the thoughts and the emotions, or is it just something that's absolutely abstract and hard to explain and bring into this material world? And we're doing both of those at the same time. And when we really start to live in both of those, like we talked about earlier, we start to see that many things are happening on many different layers at the same time, and that's what we're speaking to. Okay, this next piece speaks to, if I remember what I was going to say, I was going to say emotions, but we'll let go of that for a minute. The next piece is we'll talk about where the path starts. So a wonderful teacher, Adyashanti, basically says that the path starts when you realize that you weren't who you always thought you were, that you aren't the little you that you thought you were. And it's the idea of enlightenment is this concept of self-realization. It's the moment that you realize, like the, oh my God, not like the, yeah, I know that, like the, oh my God, I'm going to cry because it's so profound. This aha, like gong going off in your body of recognition of the big you. Like, whoa. I am not this little body. I'm so much greater. That moment is the first step on the spiritual path. It is the beginning of letting go of the little me, of letting go of the identification with the little me. The little me doesn't go anywhere. You just let go of the identification with that little me, with that little personality, with that little Sam. And everything leading up to that is just practicing for that moment so that you can keep walking on the path. So anything before that where you're like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm pretty far on the path, is actually not even on the path yet. And here's a wonderful paradox. It's a pathless path. It's not linear. And the second you think you're achieving, the second that you think you're moving towards something, the second you think you're on a linear path, and yesterday I meditated for 10 minutes, today I meditated for 20, so I'm getting better at it. That's all the mind and the ego. That's the ego wants to achieve enlightenment. It wants to experience something. But the truth is that that's not what's happening here. We're actually letting go of that piece of us, of needing to be anywhere. That you're no more enlightened if you go meditate for 20 years than sitting with yourself right now. It's the same. And usually you have to go meditate for 20 years to realize that, oh my God, I didn't have to do any of this. And that's the paradox, because you did have to do that to realize that you didn't have to do it. And that's you'll see meditators in the Himalayas, they'll be sitting in meditation for, like 15 hours straight, for, 60 days or 100 days or, 300 days. And all of a sudden one will just start laughing hysterically. Everyone will be sitting super, and one will just start laughing. And there's many reasons for this laughter, but one of the reasons is like, oh my God, I was here the whole time. I can't believe that I had to sit this long to realize that I didn't have to do this. And it's hilarious because you realize how simple it is. So the mind gets into our spiritual practice quite often and tries to make things more complicated, tries to make you think it's going to take a long time and you need specific information, you need to read these specific books, and you can only unlock it with certain keys. And that's all the mind. The mind thinks it's far on the path or not far on the path. The mind looks to others and says, wow, they're really good meditators. I'm not a good meditator. That's all the mind. So something very interesting that really we need to iron out is recognizing that. It's not that that's going to stop. My mind still does that too. It compares and it does these things, which is wonderful. But I just don't necessarily need to engage with that anymore. I don't need to watch the TV, even though it's on. So something to be really aware of is spiritual materialism and the ego playing spirituality and thinking that, once I have that quiet mind, I'll be fine. Or anytime you're trying to do anything, it's the mind. And meditation, the path of spirituality, is the absence of trying. It's not to say that you're not still doing. And here's our, I think maybe our final kind of misconception is this idea of doing and being. We have we're called human beings, not human doings. We see all these little kind of spiritual like little sentences or do less, be more. And so we have this idea because we're looking at it just from one layer, one dimension, that you can either do or you can be. And because we have this polarization that we've done, we look at doing as action and being as inaction. Like, okay, well, I can't just be all the time where I'm just going to sit in my room. And so we have this idea that if you're being, you can't be doing something. And so being, similar to acceptance, is really about where we're orienting our action from. Being means doing without trying to achieve anything. That's my definition of being. The idea of moving towards something without needing to get there is very different than doing, which is doing in order to achieve something. So doing and being are both movements, but it's actually really about the mindset that's behind the movement. Am I trying to achieve something, or am I just totally okay with where I am? So meditation is the practice of being totally okay with where we are, always. And sometimes that'll be like, I feel so good, and being totally okay with that. And then later that day, you feel like shit and being totally okay with that. Doesn't mean you have to like it. Doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. But it's just being okay with it. It's just saying, okay, well, this is just what's happening. It's just seeing what's arising and being okay with that. And so there's this huge idea between doing and being that meditation is not something that we can do. And what's doing meditation is the mind. It's trying to achieve something, and it's a huge illusion. There is nowhere to go to. There's nowhere to get. It's not linear. Yes, there are things in our life that are linear. When you go get a degree, you do your work and then you get the degree. And that's an achievement. And it's not to say that we should stop achieving things, but the path of spirituality is not the path. It's a pathless path. It's not a path. You're not walking anywhere. You're just floating around and being okay with that. So really spirituality is the act of letting go of trying. And it's funny because we have these we've been so conditioned with the doer that we have this idea of the spiritual doer. And this was me for such a long time, go to all the workshops, go to all the retreats, and the more I'm collecting, the more knowledge, the more wisdom, the more enlightened I'll get. And that's actually not the truth. And it's the truth is that the less I'm doing doesn't mean I don't go to the workshops anymore, but I don't go to them with the desire to achieve something. I just go because I love them. And I go to a lot less now because I realized that a lot of what I was doing was trying to get something that was already here the whole time, was trying to get that spaciousness, that silence, that peace, that whatever we're looking for. It was here the whole time, and I just didn't know how to recognize it. So that's kind of our last little idea there, is this paradox of like doing and being aren't opposites. They're actually on different layers. There's like action and what's motivating our action. And the last thing Adyashanti speaks about, which I actually really like, is this idea that when you start to let go of identification with this little self, with like little Sam, then a lot of the desires, the egoic desires that he had, start to fall away. Almost like you just start to become like not nearly as interested in a lot of the things that you used to be interested in, because they were really just serving the little self. And as that little self kind of peels away, then all of those peel away as well. And I think a really good way to look at that is I used to love lifting weights and exercising, and it's not that I am trying not to lift weights anymore. It's not that I don't want to. It's not that I do want to. All of a sudden, it's just kind of like I have no draw. I have no, that desire just kind of faded away without even trying to do anything. It's just not relevant anymore. And that happens with a lot of things. I used to love watching movies, and I just kind of don't watch movies anymore. Not because I'm trying not to, or I'm not bummed about it. It's just kind of like, oh, wow, I realized that I haven't watched a movie in like 8 months. Same with alcohol. And it's not to say that like these are the same things for each of us. We all have different desires and joys and habits and things like this. But what happens is that as you kind of start to remove that identification with the little you, a lot of them takes up less space in the bigger you. And that's something that's very interesting too. So if that's happening to you, then that's awesome. You're in the right place. The less things make sense, the more we're in the right space in regards to spirituality. Okay, and this is the last one because this one's really good too. So this idea of the mind, we have like a logic mind and we have this intuitive body. And spirituality, all of spirituality happens in a place beyond the mind. It's like in a space right above logic, so that logic can't quite grasp it. So it's almost like most of our life is in this logical box, and spirituality happens completely outside of it. And here's the fun part, here's the paradox, it doesn't make any sense. A lot of spirituality doesn't make sense, and that's the whole point. It can't make sense because your mind can't grasp it, because sense is logic, and logic, it's bigger than logic, it's outside of logic. And so a lot of the spiritual path it's not linear. It's not like, okay, yes, I did this, now I do that. It's completely not necessarily random, but it's not in the world of time and space. So things happen in divine timing, not in chronological timing. So it's like a flower blooms when it's ready, not when you planted it and now it's going to bloom, and we speak about that as well. So this entire process is really about letting go of the mind and what the mind thinks should happen, and just letting things happen. Things will be revealed to you when it's time, and what's being revealed to you is sacred, always. So those are our paradoxes and misunderstandings on this path. That meditation isn't a path to blissfulness, and it's not a path to complacency. It's rather a path of accepting what is and letting go of what we're not. It's not a path of doing, it's a path of being. But that doesn't mean we're not doing at the same time. It's doing from a space of being. How do I act from a space of acceptance? Accepting what is always, without trying to get anywhere. We have many layers that we're living in, many dimensions. And the more we open ourselves up to those layers, the more we see that the world and our experience at any given moment is happening on many different dimensions. And we can hold space for all of that at the same time, even if they don't add up to each other. It's a beautiful practice, this practice of spirituality. Don't let the ego sneak in. It's a very sneaky thing. This ego it's a bag of tricks. And the ego wants to stay alive. And so it's going to continue to engage you in a conversation, because that's its fuel for life, is the stories and the attention that we give it. When we start to give it less attention, we start to see that the world itself is very magical and much bigger and much more beautiful than we could ever even understand and comprehend. That doesn't mean that wonderful things are happening all the time, even though that is also the truth. Sometimes very challenging things are happening, but we start to see that challenging doesn't mean they're not wonderful. Painful doesn't mean they're not wonderful. We begin to have this intimate experience with life that transmutes everything that's happening outside because of how we're receiving it on the inside. So thank you to your dedication to the pathless path, to the space beyond what we know, what we can comprehend, into a surrender, into knowing that something bigger is holding us, something bigger than ourselves. That our mind doesn't know what's best for us because it really doesn't know the full picture. But there is something that is guiding us that knows. It's the surrender into that. It's the falling back into that, the falling into grace, the falling into the nothingness, the openness, the spaciousness that our thoughts arise upon. But before we do that, we have to see it. We have to be able to see it, and that's the practice of meditation. That's all of these practices, is expanding our awareness to see something that's been happening the whole time, but we just couldn't quite have access to it. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. It's like your eyelids, your eyelashes. You know, you can't quite see them, but they're right there. That's spirituality. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for joining this course and for being a part of this. It's been beautiful sharing. And this makes my heart so happy. So thank you for whoever's watching this, giving me the space to share something that is such a deep passion for me and such a playful world and expansive universe that makes me so happy to be able to share this. So thank you. We will end with 2 deep breaths and 3 ohms, and that'll conclude this course. You're free. That's it. You did it. This is the beginning of something. There's always something beginning. Let's take a deep inhale. We'll inhale for 3 ohms. Deep inhale. Taking a moment to rest in the spaciousness, into the big you. Thank you for your practice. Thank you for sharing your heart and for doing your part in this beautiful universe. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hari Om Tat Sat.